The dispute is not that we will rule and reign with Christ. The question is when are we ruling and reigning with Christ? I think that what all Christians ought to be able to agree on is that we have been designed to rule and reign with Christ.
Yes.
Like whenever the millennium happens, because it's the dispute is not that we will rule and reign with Christ. The question is when are we ruling and reigning with Christ? If I understand that correctly.
Very well. That's
okay.
Yes, exactly.
So let's start with what we Christians ought to agree on instead of just scooting immediately to explore our differences. And so I'm going to have Bob put this graphic back up here because I think you're absolutely right. I think many of my evangelical friends are not familiar with the amillennial or post-millennial view. So I'm going to start at the bottom on this graphic and kind of work our way up. You did such a great job summarizing it, but I want to show it to people one more time because there's sort of two forms of premillennialism. There's what most people listening to this show might be familiar with of pre-tribulational millennialism. And this is the idea of Jesus ascends into heaven. We wait for him. Then he descends to earth. And then we have the in between there at some point, we've got the 7-year tribulation. Right. Then when he comes back, it inaugurates a literal 1,000-year reign. Yep. And then we go to judgment in the eternal state. So that's probably the framework most people are familiar with. But I'm going to have Bob scroll up here to look at historical premillennialism. Similar timeline, not as hardcore on the 7-year tribulation, Antichrist type of scenario, from what I understand. These are more like classical premillennialists. So Christ comes back, again, a literal 1,000-year reign, then the judgment, then the eternal state. So we're going to scroll up here to post-millennialism. Now, this view is kind of on the rise again, Ken.
It is.
So if any of my viewers have heard of Jeff Durbin out in Phoenix, Arizona, at Apologia Church, he's a very outspoken post-millennialist. Doug Wilson and all of his followers up in Moscow, Idaho, post-millennialists. Recently, I don't know if you know this, Ken, but Dr. James White has converted to being a post-millennialist.
Wow.
And has been quite transparent about his journey into that. Used to be a premillennialist.
Okay.
So, this is kind of, to me, on the rise, and whereas it had kind of waned. It was kind of bigger more in the late 1800s, if I have that
right
correct. So but in this view, the church age kind of, if I understand it right, kind of gradually, for lack of a better term, sort of evolves into the millennium. As the gospel goes out, more and more people get saved, and communities are changed, nations are changed, so that all the nations are under the authority of Christ and become Christianized. Would that be a fair summary of that?
Yes, the post-millennialists believe very strongly that the Great Commission is successful. It's not interrupted by a tribulation period. The gospel goes forward. It transforms individuals. There's great revival. There's renewal of culture. And whether it's a Puritan version or a theonomic version, there is a period of time, either 1,000 years or something of that nature, where the world is transformed. And so rather than a very negative, pessimistic view of trouble, that the end of the world will be consumed with tribulation and persecution, the postmillennial view is the idea that the gospel of Jesus Christ and God's reign will slowly and gradually take over the earth.
Yeah, that's good. And I'm so glad you mentioned that word. They're optimistic about the gospel's triumph
Yeah.
because sometimes I think if we were to really categorize these things in a very crass way, we might say the premillennials tend to be more on the side of a little bit more pessimistic that the world will get better. They still think the gospel is going to go out, but they do seem to often have a view that the world is generally speaking going to get worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
Whereas post millennials tend to be highly optimistic that the even though things look bad right now, I know the end of the story and
Yeah.
the gospel is going to triumph and Jesus is going to, rule. So that would be a very crass, basic way of looking at different outcomes and different lenses when you're engaging with people from these perspectives. Now the amillennial view is an interesting one as well. So in that view, it's looking at the millennium from what I understand more symbolically.
Yeah.
So it would say, if I understand it correctly, that the Jesus is reigning and ruling right now in some sense, and that one day he will come again, but the church and is already ruling with Christ in some sense, and yet we also do see difficulty and death and that sort of a thing. Anything to help me refine that? Am I on the right track there?
Yes, no, you are on the right track. So again, we think of this millennium as a period of Christ's reign. Millennialists, some would say that it is Christ reigning in heaven with the martyrs. Others would say through the church. And so again, rather than a 1,000-year period, it would again relate to the church era as a whole, that Christ has come and that he reigns now. And again, if you think about these ideas in terms of the context of church history, you alluded to the idea in the 19th century, the latter part of the 19th century, there was lots of optimism. There was the idea that technology was advancing. We were moving toward peace. Then, of course, the 20th century with the great world wars kind of tipped a lot of these ideas of, wow, it seems we're living in very challenging times. But I would say that if there is a consensus position, it is probably amillennialism. Now again, you might want to touch on this a little later in the program, but probably a form of premillennialism was present very early on, maybe in the first, early second centuries, even among some of the apostolic fathers and the church fathers. Later, however, you have somebody like Augustine who writes in either a amillennial or a post-millennial view. Sometimes it's not easy to know exactly what Augustine thought of this, but I think the consensus in church history is the amillennial view, which again, sometimes the church is ascending, sometimes it's descending. And I think that's probably been kind of the default or the consensus viewpoint.
That's really helpful. And I'm glad you brought up those points in history because sometimes historical moments can cause different views of eschatology to rise and wane.
Yep.
So, the optimism of the post-Civil War world, of the Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age and all of these kind of things, I think played a role at the Second Great Awakening. These played a role in the rise of post-millennialism, and people had a perception that the world was getting better and better.
Yeah.
But then 2 world wars happened, and we remembered, oh yes, man is wicked. And then we saw the rise of premillennialism again, and that's really was the view that was dominant in my grandparents' generation, listening to Louis T. Talbot on the Biola Hour during the war. They were became very committed to a premillennial dispensational perspective. But I think that there is a connection to that in the era in which they lived, that times were very hard, and that there was a thought of the world is getting worse and worse. The world is a scary place. And so that view became, a little bit more popular. So that's important to reflect on. So I think, though, your point is also well taken, that historically speaking, the majority position has been Amillennialism. So keeping all of those things in their own context and proper place.